This is Kali Persall, editor of Institutional Investing in Infrastructure. I am joined today by Kendra Corbett, partner at Cloverlay, to talk about the voluntary carbon market. Kendra, why don't we just kick it off with a brief introduction of yourself and Cloverlay before we get into the questions?
Sure. So Cloverlay is a private equity sponsor focused entirely on what we call adjacent private markets. So we focus on niche areas within the private market ecosystem that institutional investors might not otherwise have access to. Our investment philosophy and program is tied to assets, whether they be tangible or intangible. And so that is the cornerstone of our program and how we approach each investment opportunity.
So let's talk about the voluntary carbon market. Tell me, why does it exist and where does it sit relative to other approaches that seek to reduce climate change?
Sure. So, the carbon market consists of both activity in what we call the compliance markets. So those are the regulatory driven schemes in places like Europe, California. Carbon allowances is another very sizable market, and even China has a compliance market as well. The voluntary carbon market sits outside of those regulatory systems. And it's, really for corporations that feel a social responsibility, individuals, businesses looking at customer expectations or employee retention tools that want to prove to their stakeholders that they have sustainability advantages. While I think the majority of companies would probably agree that the preferred path to net zero includes reducing their own emissions, I think there's a wide acceptance that's very challenging to achieve, particularly when you're talking about 2030 goals. To do that without sacrificing growth is an unsurmountable challenge at this point. So we have seen the growth in the voluntary market. And there's a whole variety of project types and solutions that are an option in that market. And we've explored and looked at a variety of them, and have chosen most recently to invest in Chestnut Carbon, which is a nature-based solutions provider that engages in domestic afforestation and reforestation projects.
You mentioned some challenges. What are some of the risks to buyers of voluntary carbon credits?
There's a number of things that buyers think about and look at when they approach the market. Some of the top things that we see are the first is the concept of additionality. So that's the idea that whatever project you're backing results in some kind of new net carbon removal. And you're not taking credit for carbon removal that might have otherwise happened in absence of your participation in the carbon offset market. Another thing that is a key topic is just permanence or durability. How long will your solution sequester carbon? So that can range from storing carbon underground, which currently that's an almost infinite solution to the problem, certainly greater than 1,000 years. There's lower durability solutions as well, and that tends to fall into some projects the buyers have become more skeptical of. Another area that we see of risk is something called carbon leakage. So this is the concept that projects may fail to account for situations where the deforestation, that's the perfect example of this problem, just simply shifts to areas that are outside of the project boundaries. So that undermines the efforts of the overall carbon reduction practice. Another risk that we see buyers facing is just jurisdiction. So there's a lot of projects that are occurring in emerging economies where there might be concerns over things like eminent domain, comfort in the rule of law, or property rights. We've seen a strong preference on behalf of buyers to also match some of their credits with the same jurisdiction as where they're actually emitting carbon. And so, typically that is the developed markets, and certainly, with the Chestnut Carbon project in the United States, there's a fair amount of emissions in the United States that need to be offset. And then just verifiability. What is the scientific process for measuring how much carbon is actually being sequestered? And that has certainly become a challenge in some of the earlier projects that have made the credits less valuable over time. And maybe the last thing I'd point to is just scalability. There's a lot of new ideas out there that are more nascent from a technology perspective, and potentially that makes that very difficult to achieve the kind of results that the large multinational companies are looking for when they think about achieving their net zero goals.
Yeah, thanks for covering so many aspects of that. What are the pros and cons of the different types of projects and credits that are available in the voluntary market today?
So there's really two main types of credits that we see. The first are called avoidance credits. So those are projects that seek to reduce emissions. The other class of credits are removal credits. And those actually take carbon that's already circulating in the atmosphere and sequester it in some way. About 97% of the credits that have been issued in the market have been avoidance or reduction credits, while only 3% have been removal credits. The large corporate buyers in the market have a huge preference for removal credits, and those command, from a pricing perspective, a significant premium over what's available in the avoidance market. Why are those considered inferior? It's the additionality concept that I referenced earlier. Looking back to when the carbon credit market first evolved, renewable energy was much more expensive, and you needed the additional incentive of a revenue from a carbon offset in order to make the projects economic. That is no longer the case today. And so, even in 2019, the two largest credit standards, Verra and Gold Standard, from a developed market perspective, have not issued credits related to renewable energy projects. But there's still a large portion of the volume that's currently available in the market. Switching gears to removal credits, those are projects that like I said earlier, that actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. And by far, the largest segment of the market is the afforestation and reforestation projects. And that is what we are doing with Chestnut Carbon. So that is buying acreage, and in the case of Chestnut Carbon, the gold standard requires it to have not been a forest for at least 10 years, and planting trees. The benefit of the afforestation as a type of credit is that it's very proven technology. It's been around for 400 million years. It's measurable and verifiable. And so it's from a risk perspective, it checks a lot of boxes on behalf of buyers, particularly when you're talking about a jurisdiction that you can have a lot of comfort in, like the United States. Probably the biggest negative is just the durability of the projects themselves. How long can the trees hold carbon? The other concern is reversals, and that is effectively, think about a forest fire. What happens if there's a fire and you've issued credits tied to that forest? Specifically with respect to Gold Standard, there's a large buffer pool that helps mitigate some of those concerns. But things like disease, flooding, there are project risks, but they're certainly easier to get your arms around at this stage than some of the other more nascent technologies. And then finally, probably the frequently discussed but also very expensive end of the cost curve is something called direct air capture. And so that is literally pulling carbon out of the air through large industrial plants and sequestering it underground via carbon capture and storage technology. So that is highly permanent, but very, very costly. And the credits that are being issued in that market today are north of $500 a ton. It's one that a lot of the multinationals are focused on and trying to develop, but it's still at the earlier stages. And going back to what I said earlier about being able to solve these really large problems, as emissions keep growing, we've seen estimates as high as looking just specifically at what's going on in the data center industry with AI, as high as 55 gigawatts of new capacity by the end of 2030. And that could result in an incremental 300 million tons of carbon emissions. So when you tie that back to a goal of, net zero by 2030 for Microsoft, and potentially erasing all of the company's historical emissions by 2050, it's a big challenge.